out with is the big news the last couple of months. Give us your take on the Vergara decision.
You know, so one, I'm a supporter of the plaintiffs, and I'm happy with the decision. I think it's very indicative of what's going on in our state, and frankly, the need for fundamental change in our state, because we have a situation where there are a number of laws in the Ed Code that the vast majority of educators, vast majority of folks who are involved in this work, vast majority of parents, when they hear about it, know those laws don't make sense for kids. But the current leadership in Sacramento, the state superintendent, the legislature, for many years just let those laws sit there until 9 students actually filed a lawsuit. So, and I think that kind of lack of leadership, where it requires a lawsuit by students rather than true leadership by elected officials to really drive change that we know our kids need, was a big challenge. I think once that lawsuit started, we should have seen, once the students sued the state, and certainly the state superintendent, whose job it is to advocate for kids and really be an independent leader for kids, should have immediately told the judge, I side with the plaintiffs, and should have been the first witness for the plaintiffs, from my perspective, given, again, that those of us who have worked in schools and led schools know that those are laws that make it very difficult and more difficult to educate kids. Once the judge had his ruling in terms of, citing for the plaintiffs, which is a very good thing from my perspective, again, would have liked to have seen a state superintendent and leadership in Sacramento that says, okay, the judge ruled, let's move forward and let's actually start a process to really come forward and think about what are the right focus areas around teacher tenure and seniority-based layoffs, and the fact that it's impossible to dismiss teachers. And for me, it's representative of the work I've done for the last 12 years, because we actually filed a lawsuit. I was instrumental in helping to file the Reed lawsuit in 2010, and that was a direct output of the fact that when, I led the Partnership for LA Schools, and we took over the worst schools in LA, and in 2009, 8 months after we took over the worst schools, we had one school, Markham Middle School, where 48% of our teachers got layoff notices and 46% at Gompers. And so we actually filed a similar lawsuit and had a similar circumstance where it ended up being the teachers union fought against our lawsuit. Even though we settled with the district, the teachers union fought it, and the current state superintendent actually filed a legal brief against us there. So I've just seen firsthand that it is harder for principals and ultimately for teachers and parents to educate kids because of the laws that Vergara went after. I'm happy the judge sided with it. I also recognize it's just one step towards a number of different issues that need to be improved to make sure we have an effective teacher in every classroom, which is essential for our schools.
Well, but if you're elected, you will be that superintendent within a few months.
Absolutely.
And the legal system does not grind that quickly. So what would you do as the new superintendent in terms of this lawsuit specifically?
Yeah, so step one is assuming that, and we won't know the answer for a while, but if the current state superintendent appeals, I will immediately withdraw the appeal as state superintendent, which I can legally do. So that's step one, to make it very clear that the top education official does not believe it should be appealed. So come January, I pull the appeal and make it clear to the appellate court that I strongly support the plaintiffs. I don't think it should be appealed, and I think they should drop it. And then secondly, it's about how do you actually start a focused conversation that brings together, in my opinion, superintendents from up and down the state, brings together, I think, some university presidents and deans of the school eds, it brings together teachers' leadership to try to put together what is the path forward for tenure, seniority-based layoffs, and the dismissal process. And we need to start soon, because what often gets forgotten in Sacramento, because you have a lot of politicians running things, is that there's a school year. And I think if with a focused effort, we could get in a position by April, May, we can have a solution moving forward for the 15-16 school year. And for me, that solution on tenure, again, this is a starting point. I think you have to have an ongoing regular dialogue, because we got to get it right. But for me, a tenure as a principal, it should be longer and more rigorous. I think a starting point, like in our state, the community colleges have a 4-year tenure process, which is more rigorous, that their teachers, their administrators, and their students are generally happy with. That's an interesting place to start, because it's something that's already working in California. There's other solutions that people could put on the table, but it's got to be longer and something that's actually earned versus just given based on time frame. For seniority, for layoffs, I think it has to start with performance versus seniority in terms of where that needs to be. And then in terms of dismissal, I do believe teachers need additional due process, but they don't need right now. They don't just have traditional due process like other public employees. They actually have due process plus a number of statutes that make it almost impossible to remove not just dangerous teachers, but also highly ineffective teachers. And so for me, it's about bringing the right group of people together with a focused effort, but also leading with a vision on where should things go.
So you're saying that they need due process, but not to the extent they have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we took over literally in 2008. We took over another school in East LA where I had to pull 3 adults off campus for physically actually hitting kids. And we weren't able to fire those adults. And actually, they told us to put them back in the classroom. I said absolutely not, refused to do it. And we had to rent out office space, which was horrible for everybody, on taxpayers' money, terrible for people's dignity to have people sit in the office because we wouldn't put them back in school. They said we couldn't fire them. And you have this long, arduous process that doesn't make sense.
Help me understand, what exactly have you done over these years, education-wise? I'm not quite sure I understand what your role has been in.
Okay.
Okay.
So
explain it.
Yeah. So I jumped into education full time in 2002, and for me, I made the decision that I wanted to spend my time and energy helping as many people have a better life as possible. Just that for me, kind of combination of values I was raised with and grown up, and I decided that I'm getting off the material success train and jumping on the helping people have a better life train. And to me, there's nothing more important than education to do that. I started at Green Dot Public Schools, where I was the president of that organization. Green Dot is a charter school organization based in Los Angeles. We opened we opened new charter schools in the highest need areas of LA. One thing's forgotten in the public, we were the first unionized charter school network in the state and the country. It just was a rational union contract, and we actually, I negotiated that contract. So I helped build that organization from 1 school to 10 schools over about 4.5 years as the president. And then I left there at the end of 2006, and in 2007, former LA Mayor Villaraigosa asked me to lead his education efforts.
Why did you leave in 2006?
Because two reasons. I mean, Villaraigosa asked me to run his school effort, and also, as I mentioned, I got an education with a focus on how can I help as many people as possible. And I felt that both Green Dot and charter schools, you were seeing some real innovation and change in charters, but that original promise of charters as innovation labs for the districts, it wasn't translating to district change. And I felt working directly in district schools rather than in charter schools would help from what I could do in terms of driving more change to a large number of kids. And so we took over at the partnership. It was a different kind of structure, but think of it as essentially the school board in LA gave a contract for us to run their lowest performing schools. Principals reported up to us, still had to follow the ed code, still had to follow the labor agreements, but we had flexibility to run the schools. And so I created that organization with the former mayor and led that organization from 2007, January of 2007, until I left that job at the end of July.
So the school would contract with, is this the same with Green Dot?
No, sorry, it was a new entity. So
Okay.
I left Green Dot to work with the mayor. Or if you rewind the clock, Villaraigosa was trying to get full control of schools. He wasn't able to do that. So then we actually created this nonprofit called the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools, a new entity. Think of it as a school district within LA Unified. And the district outsourced, they basically contracted with us to run the lowest performing schools, elementary, middle, and high schools in Los Angeles. So all of our schools were Watts, South LA, East LA, all were lowest 5% of schools in the state that we were targeted. So we took those schools over in July of 2008.
And how have they performed?
So in the 5 years since I left, since I started when we launched the organization until when I left, we had the highest improvement on the API of any school district, more than 10,000 kids. So there's 163 school systems in LA with more than in California with more than 10,000 kids. We had the highest improvement on the API, highest improvement in terms of moving kids into proficiency in math and English, and we increased our graduation rates from what was 36% was the 4-year grad rate when we got there to 58% in 5 years. So certainly a long way to go, but 22 raw percentage points and actually a 60% increase in grad rates was comparatively as fast as you'll find with big systems.
And what was at the core of that?
The fun part about schools is that we actually know what works. So it wasn't like we reinvented the wheel. So first step one was finding the best principals we could find and get them to come to the toughest schools. And we paid our principals more. You had to, because to go work at Jordan High School or Markham Middle School, it's a longer commute, it's a much harder job. And so we offered substantial stipends for principals to come and take those jobs, and you can make about $20,000 more as a partnership principal versus in a traditional district school. And we also, our whole belief was empower principals, like get the bureaucracy out of the way and let them be successful. Secondly is we invested heavily in teacher professional development. And this is something we miss so often, where we want teachers to change their practices, but we're not giving them enough time to actually learn how to change that. So in the summertime, we ran a summer institute where we had an additional week of training for a number of our teacher leaders. We built a lot of more training time into the school year. We gave stipends to our best teachers so they could teach their peers. You know, I've found in my career that kind of a peer-to-peer model where you find your best practicing educators and have them share with each other is the fastest way to share practices. We invested a lot in technology in our schools. We made sure kids had the right classes, which sounds obvious, but in a lot of our schools, kids were not even being offered the appropriate classes to graduate high school or go to college. And we invested very heavily in parent engagement. We launched a parent college on Saturdays in our schools, 9 a.m. to 1 p.m., where we had our teachers teach our parents how to get more involved in their kids' educations. And you know, our community's average education level is 9th grade of our parents, a lot of single-family households, a lot of foster, but people still love their kids. You just got to work harder in schools like Jordan and Markham and Roosevelt to get parents more involved. And so when you put all those pieces together, and then lastly, we use kind of sharp elbows, creativity, and some of our political benefit mayor to try to clear as much bureaucracy out of the way for our teachers to be successful. But you know, kind of as I mentioned, there was actually so many experiences while leading the partnership, even though I was really proud of our success, where personally I became convinced that without changing the politics of education in Sacramento, we'll never educate all kids in our state, which is ultimately why I decided to leave the partnership and run for this full time.
What do you see as the ongoing role of charter schools? We're getting some blowback here. I'm sure you're familiar with Rocket Ship and its planned expansion, and that's gotten a lot of pushback now in San Jose, which may be more situational than anything, but it's definitely hard to take these schools to scale. We've always been very supportive of the movement, but I'm not sure at this point where it goes as far as transforming large numbers of schools.
Well, I mean, the personal decision that I made when I went from Green Dot to the partnership, I think charters have a very important role to play, but was that the big systems weren't moving fast enough. And I actually think that that's not necessarily the charter's complete responsibility to do. I think the lack of leadership in Sacramento, and to a large extent, to some extent in certain school districts, is preventing school districts from saying, okay, were there some things that we've learned from charters that help them be successful, and how do we translate that? So, like for me very specifically, I have a unique perspective. I ran a school system, which was a charter school system at Green Dot, where we had freedom from the ed code, and I ran a school system at the partnership where we didn't. And there is no question that it is more difficult and challenging to educate children in the high regulation environment of the ed code. And so the conversation that I have with superintendents all the time is, rather than having this kind of fight, you know, which you mentioned, Barbara, comes up in a lot of communities, charter versus not, if we know that more flexibility is helping have more innovation, and in some cases, not all cases, by the way, in some cases more success in charters, how do we bring that kind of flexibility over to traditional school districts at a much faster pace? Because if it's good enough for 500,000 kids in public schools and charters today to have more flexibility, why not have that in the traditional district? And so I think part of the reason we're getting stuck in these fights back and forth, you know, charter versus not, is that the big school systems aren't changing fast enough. I think there are real barriers to doing so that come from Sacramento. And then you have, in some cases, charters, whether it be extending too fast. I think the state isn't doing a good enough job of shutting down bad charters, which I think would also would deliver on what the whole point was, which is more flexibility for more accountability. And I think there's a lot of work that a proactive state superintendent could do right now to get moving and give, you know, one, much more political cover, but really two, kind of put together some accountability systems on charters that aren't making the grade that do need to get shut down. And then lastly is we just don't invest in collaboration between charter school leaders and successful educators and traditional district successful educators. And you know, my experience has been when you put educators in the same room and there's good work and there's good dialogue, they don't really care so much where you come from, charter or traditional district. But there's very few districts where you see the district investing in that collaboration, as well as, frankly, not enough charter school funders where they're giving the additional capacity for the charter school organizations to be able to collaborate. And that's something I think, again, where the right kind of leadership from Sacramento, you know, you could very much see a state superintendent raising, you don't need a ton of money, a decent amount of money privately, and do charter school district collaborations where you're truly giving dollars and stipends to educators from different charter schools and traditional district schools, as well as school network leaders to collaborate with each other. And that's how I think we move the work forward and go from charter versus district to what works the best for kids, first and foremost. And if there are things that are working well in charters, how do we not just talk about sharing practices, but take the actual actions to implement sharing practices? And then secondly, if there are unintended consequences of charters, bad schools still being left open that shouldn't be. In some cases, when you have a choice system, you will see a higher concentration of really challenging kids in traditional district schools. So how do you address that with policy rather than kind of these motive fights that really waste a lot of energy that should be focused on educating kids?
Talk about, when you talk about these better systems, how do you measure them? This in part goes with testing. You talked about, this keep the better teachers when you talked about layoffs earlier.
Yeah.
How do you propose measuring?
Yeah, so what we've tried to do in the different organizations I've led, so at the partnership we asked ourselves a lot, like, how do we define success? And what we did is we analyzed all school districts of decent size up and down the state. We looked at how effective were they at moving students up in terms of improvement on state achievement tests. We looked at graduation rates, and we're moving towards also promotion rates. So graduation rate you can just use for high school, but we can look at actually 8th grade promotion rate, 8th to 9th promotion in terms of how many kids are really graduating middle school with C's or better, and that's something that we don't do enough of, which you can move towards. We looked at decreases in suspensions, we looked at attendance, we did surveys every year of our staff and our parents, so we actually would have surveys coming in to analyze, what was, one, how did staff feel about the organization, but two, what were parents feeling about their school and otherwise, and that to me is what we call kind of the multiple measures, and that's where I think the state needs to be moving to, where you certainly have to have, I'm a supporter of a standardized test across core subjects on a regular basis, equal norm. Yeah, I am. I think that it's important if we have standards for learning. I think asking every child to take a test once a year on those standards and looking particularly at growth as a key metric is important. It shouldn't necessarily be the entire decision for a school or an individual. In our schools now for teacher evaluations, we looked at we always thought that the evaluation of the supervisor was the most important aspect of it. We invested heavily to make sure our principals knew that. We did look at student achievement. To me, we always thought kind of 25 to 35% was the right band. But to me, I think you leave that to the local school communities to do. But absolutely, you need to have student achievement growth as a part of how you evaluate your teachers. We also looked at what we call collaboration to school community. So if there's a teacher who spent a lot of time helping mentor their other teachers, that should be a part of their evaluation. If there's teachers who are doing a ton on leadership or sports program, going above and beyond their day job.
Let me ask you, this is always a balancing act, but did you come up with some sort of system?
Yeah, so
that's actually, here's how we're going to evaluate. This is what's going to count. How these relative.
So we have a system. We couldn't implement across all teachers. So it was an opt-in system because of the state laws and the collective bargaining agreements. We actually couldn't unilaterally impose it. But as I mentioned, what that system looked like was for teacher evaluation, it was 50% or so in terms of your evaluation of your principal. A third was student achievement growth, and then we were looked at contribution to school community. And we were moving to, at the high school level, which we hadn't implemented at a kind of a sheer number, student feedback on surveys. So we actually did do the surveys. We hadn't actually factored that into their equation. So we rolled out the system. Our ability to implement that is impacted based on the state laws, and in our case, also the collective bargaining agreements in LA Unified, because we were still part of that collective bargaining unit. But I think that is the structure and framework. And from my perspective, I think the state's job is to help. I think you give school districts flexibility on what that looks like. I don't think you dictate that at a state level. I think the state puts together a framework, so it needs to include, supervised evaluation, some student achievement growth, other factors, but you leave that up to local school districts to figure out. I think once the state makes too many decisions, it can be problematic for learning and innovation.
We've talked about state code numerous times already, or you have already in this discussion. Tell me what the 3 top things you would want to change in the state law.
Yeah, well, I think
will give you the flexibility you say you want.
Yeah, so I think a starting point in terms of Vergara, right? So ultimately, the laws that Bergara goes after prevent schools from being able to really hire their people, keep their people, and remove their people. And those are a number of different laws. But I absolutely believe the three main laws around 2-year tenure, seniority-based layoffs, and removing ineffective teachers. Those laws need to be changed in order to have much more effectiveness locally and more flexibility locally. I think you also still find some things in the Ed Code that make it difficult for innovation with technology. So the way we define seat time in the Ed Code, it's still very much, are you actually seat in a classroom for the vast majority of the day is how you get reimbursed with ADA. And I think thinking through, if we want to really think about both leveraging technology and integrating kind of 21st century career tech, I think that you want to enable some more innovation around how to do that at the school level, and you're seeing some more of that in certain charter schools because they have more flexibility than you find in traditional public schools. And then there's just kind of smaller things that, even things I think make sense, but they don't necessarily be in the Ed Code. So even with LCFF, which I think is a good piece of policy to give more local control and reallocate dollars, we still held on to, you get additional dollars if you have 24-to-1 at the K-3 level. That's still written into the state Ed Code. And while I'm a believer in smaller class size, why would the state dictate that and hold money based on that rather than, most schools would probably still use that additional money for 24-to-1, but you could see a school like, Griffith Joyner Elementary, where I was, elementary school, 100% high poverty, 90% of the kids coming from the housing projects next door, they might want to go to 26-to-1 and hire an additional psychologist for that school, just given the social emotional needs that kids have. And so there's still like a lot of smaller pieces of that code that just make it harder for principals and teachers to make their decisions locally.
How do you feel about the way the Common Core is being implemented? We don't think it's a conspiracy. It sounds like a great, theoretically, it's a great idea. It seems to be moving at a pace that neither teachers nor parents understand or can deal with. What's your sense of that? That may be just my perception.
I don't think we have done a good job as a state of rolling out the Common Core, and I think the symptom and the end result is what you're saying, which is a lot of confusion and concern amongst teachers, parents, and others. Now, I start with the premise that even if we do a great job rolling it out, it's still going to be tough because it's change, and I think as we all know, when you have to make changes to your behaviors, it is difficult. That being said, I think that the responsibility on the state to roll it out as best as possible. And if you look historically what happened, in 2010, as a state, we decided we were moving to the Common Core. And it wasn't literally until late spring of 2013, after schools had already done their budgets, where the state actually allocated any additional dollars for this transition to Common Core. So you have school districts, you make your decisions in the spring. So are you going to have teachers come over the summer for more training, all that kind of stuff? We didn't even fund that. We did a 1-year funding, right? We've gone kind of 1 year to 1 year. This is a 3 to 4 year minimum rollout that requires substantial additional investment to give more dollars for teacher and principal training because they need more time to get up to speed on that. And so we didn't do that. We also didn't give any indication of what we're doing on testing until late August of 2013. Again, this is all 3 years after we said we were going there. And when you think about the reason that I think parents are so concerned is that we dropped this on teachers at the start of the 2013-14 school year and said, okay, good luck. With literally, unless the school district was ahead of the game, which some were, but with no support or guidance from the state level. And so you have a lot of people scrambling to put this in place, and teachers are overwhelmed, and that translates right over to parent and kid concern. And so what I think needs to happen immediately is the state needs to say, this is the largest transition we've made academically in a long time. The most important part of the transition is helping our teachers and principals learn how to use this, which is an investment over multiple years in additional professional development, and also a focused effort to find districts and charter school networks that are further ahead right now on implementation, find out what they're doing, and sharing those best practices as fast as possible, which is something the state can be doing really efficiently. It doesn't do it all very well right now. And then also, I think, communicating with parents to just at least decrease the concern if there's communication. But I think we made a good decision on suspending the accountability for the testing this year. I think that was a good decision. But again, I think that when you go to the next level of that decision, we suspended the testing, but we still gave the kids the test, and we're not giving the results to teachers, parents, or students, right? And if the whole point is to get people comfortable and learn, let's do a pilot year, but still give people the information so you can kind of get used to this change and transition.
Let me ask you two questions that you out of that. First of all, are you saying then that the superintendent of public instruction, the superintendent's office should have done more in the Department of Education
Yes.
on the transition?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I believe strongly that the state superintendent is the top education official in the state, and obviously there's limitations to the official power that that position has. It does have some things by definition, but also this is the office that should be leading on. Here's what the transition should look like. Here is the plan for the legislature to put forward, which to me should have been a multi-year financial investment focused on the development of the educators to make this big transition, doing it early and giving a set level of certainty, and then advocating as hard as possible for that with the legislature, as well as the second thing is what the state needs to kind of transition culturally is from a department which really focuses on compliance and regulation to how do you identify what's working in schools and share that as fast as possible. So what the state should have spent the last year and a half doing is find school districts, and there are many of them in individual schools, that were further ahead on Common Core implementation. Find out what they're doing and then sharing that. You know, there's no reason you can't think about a world where, and what I would do out of the gates in January, and what I plan to do in 2014 is, you can give existing educators, principals, math teachers, English teachers, superintendents, additional stipends for them to go and with technology, you can do just what we're doing here. You can do Google Hangouts, and you actually have conversations around what they did to implement Common Core in the first year and a half where they saw successful, and you allow other educators to learn from that, rather than right now, if you go on the CD website and try to find like high value quality resources to help you think about your implementation for Common Core as a teacher, as a principal, as a parent, you'll find it's very difficult to find and very confusing, and that's where leadership isn't always, I mean, leading is about putting the vision forward and taking actions that you can do, and the CDE is, I think, has real responsibility to help guide educators on this very difficult but also I think important transition for the state.
The second thing you talked about is the testing rollout. There's a struggle between Arnie Duncan and Superintendent's Office in California over this issue. How should it have been resolved?
Well, I think step one is, we're not in a good place with the federal government right now, and that I think is also part of the state superintendent's responsibility. And it doesn't mean you have to agree with the federal government and everything, but we have to have a good relationship so we can move the work forward for kids. And I think a perfect example was where, the state superintendent didn't move forward to try to get flexibility from No Child Left Behind waivers, and it ended up being 10 school districts in the state went got their own.
I'm specifically talking about the testing.
So to me, that the step I think that saying that we're gonna not do STAR testing, but do full Common Core testing this year, and have it not be held accountable, was the right decision. I think if we had actually led with that out of the gates with the Secretary of Education, with Duncan, we would have been successful. So if you take back the history clock, originally we said we weren't going to do any testing, and then it was after there was pressure we said, okay, we'll do the pilot testing with no accountability. I think we should have done full testing versus the pilot. I'm not dogmatic about it, because I think you just learn more by doing a full pilot.
So the results should have been released?
Yes, I think definitely. Because
why?
Because we're trying to learn from this process, both in terms of teachers getting comfortable with the transition to Common Core, students getting comfortable with that transition. We want to get feedback from teachers and principals about, hey, how did the test actually work for you? How can we improve that? If they don't have the results, you're actually leaving valuable information on the table. And I think also there's going to be a transition for parents when we move to releasing the results for our kids, because it's a harder test and kids are going to most likely do worse than they've done historically. So I think doing that in a pilot, no stakes, hey, this is an early test year, you just help people, you bring people along better than keeping it all kind of in a black box by just folks in Sacramento seeing and then rolling out in one fell swoop next year, which I think it's just not the right way to build support for it and also to learn from it.
Hey, Marshall, you talked about relationships with the federal government, and I'm real curious about relationships with the teachers union. Your opponent is, I would say closely tied, and I've heard it said that you have had unions in your schools, and so that you're used to working with them. Well, that's different from being effective and being able to work with the legislature that has close ties to some of these unions. How would you go about working on your relationship with the teacher, or how would you characterize your relationship with the teacher unions? How do you see that working so you can be effective in a legislature where there may be some challenges?
Yeah, so I think it's a great point, and I recognize it takes time. I mean, first, the teachers union and their allies spent $4.5 million to support Torgerson and to do negative ads on me in the primary. So I don't clarify as a very good relationship from their perspective, since they spent the most they've ever spent in any election against us in the primary. I think they see me as a threat because I am somebody who's actually worked only in union schools. I'm somebody who's actually negotiated a different kind of union contract. I've run schools. I'm not. They try to vilify me as a outside banker, billionaire, all this kind of stuff. But the reality is I'm somebody who's actually has a proven track record in schools. And so that's seen as a threat. That being said, I know without question, to get to where California needs to get to, which is everybody focused on a kid-first agenda, we're going to need the governor, the legislature, the state superintendent, the teachers union, and parents all on the same team. It's going to take a long time to get there. I am not naive about that. And so I think the way I address this when I start working, I don't think they'll get behind me in this campaign, but I plan on working with them in January. And it's got to be a combination. I always kind of say educate and organize. And this is both with the CTA, but also with the legislature. The educator part is, what I've found is when we actually get elected officials to come to schools and talk to kids and parents, not like on a cutting the ribbon, celebratory, but actually really touching the work and seeing the impact some of these laws have on kids' lives, and hear what I hear from parents about frustrating stories about not being able to move teachers to their schools or not be able to drive change. I think you see more moderates that can come around with that political cover. So step one for me is we're going to kind of put together, educational conversations and tours for members of the legislature, particularly, offer it to everybody, but I think you'll see some moderates from both sides of the aisle participating, where they can learn the impact of their policy actually on kids. And then the second part is organize. Like, I actually do believe ultimately that there's nothing more important for a state superintendent than to be an independent leader for kids and parents. And right now, the current state superintendent is way too tied to CTA, and CTA has too much influence over education policy. And I think that fundamental power dynamic has to shift. And I believe that the way that happens is there are parent groups up and down our state now that are organized more and more regionally. And with technology, the ability for an active state superintendent to make sure that they know when policy is being discussed and debated, that those parents group do in Sacramento, and they have an efficient way to communicate their opinion at that policy, that's how I think you start to see a parent voice increase in influence, which can then hopefully decrease the undue influence that CTA has. Now, so that's kind of the organized. But in parallel, when I filed for office, I called CTA right away. They didn't return my call, but nonetheless I did. And CFT actually I have a relation with Josh Peschalt. He didn't return my call. But I'll call them every single day going forward, and I'll try to work with them on a lot of things that we agree on. Things like we need much more investment in teacher professional development. Things like I believe without question, until our state gets serious about attracting young people and career changers to go into teaching, we're not going to get there, which requires creativity on compensation and in other areas. And so I think there's areas where we have alignment, which I'll try to work on with them on, but be realistic that I think until that power dynamic shifts a bit, I don't know if we get the big things done that we need to get done. And I also recognize what I don't know, which is, I'm kind of running against the status quo. I'm running for kids, but by nature it's against a lot of status quo. So I've got work to do to build relationships in Sacramento and to learn how it works up there. That being said, I'm not completely new to politics. I worked, with Viragosa for 7 years in the heart of LA. It's certainly not Sacramento, but in terms of figuring out how to work with different electeds and how to bring kind of bureaucrats along that may be against you up front, but give them some wins are things I do have experience doing it. And then obviously I got to keep reaching out to the governor on a regular basis because that's essential. But I think of a long-term view. I think of this position 8 years. That's how long I plan on being in there, because I think the big changes in California, these are decade changes that require relentless focus, consistent push, olive branch and stick in parallel, all focus on whatever makes the most sense for kids.
Let's sort of expand on that for a second. You talk about much more investment in teacher development. You talk about your relationship, building a relationship with the governor. You talk on your website about pushing for more money for schools. I think we probably agree with you that restructuring teacher pay so that the incentives are right and so that there's a rewards for performance makes more sense. But the notion of more money out of the state budget for schools, when it is, frankly, hamstringing almost single-handedly the rest of the budget, I'm not sure how you do that.
Yeah.
And so I asked you for the reality check.
Yeah.
Do you really expect to get a bigger portion of the state budget?
I think with a decade view, yes. I don't expect to get done in a couple of years. I mean, I think.
How much of the state budget do you think should go for state?
So I think right now, if you look at our state, even with Prop 30, unadjusted for cost of living, we're still going to be about 34th, I believe, in terms of spending per pupil. And when you adjust for cost of living, even with Prop 30, we're still going to be in the 40s in terms of our spending per pupil compared to other states. So I just think as a collective state, we need to. It's a longer-term goal, but we have to set a goal of how do we actually get to the point where we're at least at the national average, which to me is got to be at least a minimum for California. And I think that step one is we have to build confidence amongst the voters in our schools. So this isn't something that I go after right away. And to me, confidence happens on two different ways. One is it's essential that we have transparency on where the Prop 30 dollars go and where the LCFF dollars go. And I think if you look at that conversation right now, what's missing is there's a lot of focus on the LCAP and plans on what schools plan to do with the money, but there has been no additional adjustments in terms of back-end financial reporting so we can truly see where did that money actually go. And that's something that as state superintendent I'll push on right away, where we have to have districts and school at the school level reporting of the money that they actually have, where it's being spent. So one, we can build some confidence with transparency, and two, so that we can actually identify what's working. Secondly is, while it certainly can't unlock billions and billions of dollars, what you'll find when you take the ed code, which is about 3 times the size of this book in 4-point font, and decrease it, and you give schools a little more flexibility, you'll find time that's more time from a current professionals in the system that is actually focused on teaching and learning, and more dollars freed up. So like at Green Dot, we were able to pay our teachers more than just about every other local school district in the area on the public dollar, because we were much leaner on other parts of our budget. Now we weren't able to pay them 50% more, but we actually got them about 10% more, because we actually had other areas where we were able to get kind of more creative on how we structured our staffing, more creative on the school schedule, and then we decreased in costs on the non-teaching personnel in order to actually increase teacher pay. So those are some things where, with the current dollars in the system, because we had the flexibility, you actually could see more dollars put into teacher pay. And then I do believe there are some areas in the budget, and again, I don't pretend to say it's in a year or two, and I also recognize there's a lot to be learned by me doing it, but when we have a state where we spend nationally the highest percent of our budget on incarceration, and we're still below the average on percent of our state budget on education, that just seems like there's areas to do some reallocation of dollars that are possible. Difficult, yes. Do I have the perfect solution today on how you get there politically? No. But do they just make sense that we need to get there? If education is our top priority of the state, is it possible? I think it's possible, and look forward to digging in and trying to figure that out.
Let's talk about a big ticket item for those budgets that just got a whole lot bigger. As superintendent, you would sit on CalSTRS.
Mm-hmm.
Give me first your evaluation of the CalSTRS funding plan, which is best.
So I think that I believe that too much was put just on the districts. So essentially, it's kind of we made this claim that with Prop 30 we're going to substantially improve funding per kid, but the reality is over time, as that STRS payment starts to kick up more and more, you're going to see the vast majority of additional dollars are going to basically just go into fund STRS. And so I think that that's a problem in terms of what we're able to do for kids and dramatically improving, whether it be teacher quality or counselors or more school day, the things you want to do with more dollars are going to be hampered in 5 to 6 years as the STRS money kicks in. So I think that, first of all, I'm glad we're addressing it. So sorry, I should have started with very glad a solution is on the table. I think that the framework of the solution in terms of splitting the cost between the payers themselves and their teachers, between the state and between the district, I think is the right 3 areas where the dollars come from. I think that it's disproportionate at the district level right now.
How would you have done it differently?
So I think that's what I come back. I think that this would be the time to say, how does the state allocate some additional dollars on the STRS front? It's not just pushing it.
You would have pulled more money.
Yeah, the state, because essentially what they did with the district, they didn't solve how the district's going to pay for it. They just said the district has to pay for it, and now the districts have to, over the next couple of years, figure out how to pay for it. I would have said, no, the state has to pay for it, and let's figure out how the state pays for it. The solution hasn't been, like, the framework is set. How folks are going to pay for this is still has not been figured out. But I think a higher percentage for the state portion, particularly since it was the state that decided to increase the benefits, a couple of decades ago, and not the district, is I think what is where you need to start.
Tell me you're thinking about the 32-year paydown.
Yeah, on STIR.
The amortization, 32-year amortization. Yeah.
I don't. So sorry, I'm not.
Okay, CalSTRS has an unfunded liability.
Yep.
This whole thing was about paying down that
Yeah.
liability. They basically are paying it off over 32 years.
Yeah. You're saying the assumptions they're using in the
No, we'll get to the assumption in a second.
Yeah.
I'm just actually asking you what you think of the 32-year amortization period.
I actually don't have a great answer on that one, frankly, in terms of my knowledge of it. So I understand it's amortized over 30. In terms of the question.
Is that a reasonable period? Too long? Too short?
Yeah. I mean, I don't have a big opinion on that.
Tell me what you think about their investment assumptions.
So I think that they're a bit aggressive. I think ultimately the discount rate you use is typically going to define the size of the liability, and I think that one of the reasons we've gotten into this challenge is because of using kind of really rosy assumptions, and I think that my understanding of the discount rate is it's assuming too much in terms of what we're going to make on a go-forward basis.
We have been watching carefully the whole issue of training teachers about their mandated reporting responsibilities. Mm-hmm. Have you been following this? Mm-hmm. Give us your take on what you think should be happening.
I think that's an example where, like, my overall philosophy of the state is the state should get out of the way, except for areas of student safety, not get out of the way, but should try to empower as much as possible, except when it comes to student safety, civil rights, and I think accountability in terms of our results getting done. And so I think as it relates to the reporting, I think you guys actually talked about this, and I agree with it, which is the districts just haven't gotten the job done, and let's be very clear about a state-mandated reporting requirement, and actually the state can, I think, mandate what districts need to actually do. And there's just no reason from a flexibility perspective that a district can't present alternative, like you make a state mandate, and you leave the flexibility if a district provides, hey, let's say the state does a 30-minute online for folks who've already been through an in-person training for new people, and 30-minute online annual on a re-up basis every single year. That if a district has an alternative, they can still put that forward and try to get support from the district. So you're not completely, demanding the state to have all the solution. But that to me seems like it's a very viable and something like that. Given all we've been through as a state in the last couple of years, the state should mandate and ensure it's happening very effectively. But again, I always like to have flexibility for if a district comes up with something better that they think is more efficient, is doing a better job, then they should be able to apply for a different solution from the state, but not the opposite way around right now, where the state's basically saying, hey, you have to make sure it happens, but doesn't give any kind of guidance or quality control on how that would happen.
Yeah.
You guys, is that right?
No. Well, let me ask you one thing. We had Lieutenant Governor was in here the other day, and since that job doesn't have anything to do, he's interested in education. I'm not running for it, but talking about it. And one of the things that we discussed and that he advanced was his belief that there is not just in this state, but in this country, there is a dire need to change the entire model of education in terms of that's a model that was built on agrarian society and 3 months off. The whole business. Conceptually, do you agree with that? And then, if you do or don't, if you do, how would you do it?
And so I believe we need fundamental change in our schools, and I think that when you think about how fast the world is changing and how slow the school classroom or the school has changed, it just by definition tells you we have significant room to grow. To me, step one does come back to flexibility locally. I think the more flexibility you give to public schools, the more you're going to see different kinds of innovation. One of the reasons I think you see more creative school models in charter schools is because they have more flexibility to do things with their school day, with their school year, to be creative about kind of the type of curriculum they're offering. And I think that what the state's job should be is you need to empower more innovation locally, but also have a very strong ability to identify what's working, to share it quickly, and then also intervene when folks aren't successful. I think the second thing we have to address is we just don't have enough talent coming into teaching. And by nature, innovation happens when you create a really collaborative environment that you give folks a lot of room and flexibility to do their job and work with each other and try different things, and you have high quality talent coming into it. And so right now there's just not a lot of young people nor career changers that are going into teaching, and we have to really lift up the profession, because what you find in most, whether it's education or anywhere else, if you actually have the right kind of talent coming in and you give them a lot of flexibility to do their work and you support them by letting them know what's working elsewhere, you'll see real innovation and change. And I certainly have plenty of ideas in terms of what I think a school in 2015 or 2025 can look like, but I don't think the state dictates that. I think the state's job is create the conditions for as much local success as possible, and we have some work to do in terms of how you attract young people to want to come into teaching. And it does, the work rules are a problem. If you know you can get fired, regardless of how good you are, based on your years of service, you are less likely to go into that profession. If you know that your ability to make enough money to buy a house and live in the community you actually teach in is completely dependent on your years of service, and even then you might not be able to do it in some neighborhoods, you're less likely to go into teaching, right? There's not a coincidence we have a real shortage in math science, computer science teachers because of their alternatives. And so I think that's something, again, it's a long-term issue. It's not something you can solve right away, but what you can do is start making the policy decisions and creating the environment that allows for much more of the innovation that Lieutenant Governor Newsom was probably talking about, that you do see, and you see in private schools, and you see in some charter schools, and actually some public schools as well. So I went to the school in Santa Barbara, Dos Pueblos High School, and the place was incredible in terms of some of the stuff they're doing. It's a traditional public school, but where they had a lot of support from the community. They had a superintendent was pretty sharp elbows about getting the bureaucracy out of his way and giving his principals and teachers a lot of room. And what they were doing in this engineering academy was incredible. They had a uniquely talented person leading it, but that being said, we can learn from that to help spread that for other folks to try different similar things.
Well, one of the things that teachers, when posed with these kinds of things, will tell you repeatedly is, look, teaching isn't what it was when you went to school, when I went to school, certainly not when I went to school. And things have changed, and there's all kinds of discipline problems. We can't get rid of kids, disruptive kids. I know you know all of that, but your experience in schools that have not performed well, I assume you have a lot of experience in this area.
Yeah.
And what did you find, and what did you learn on how to deal with those things in a public school environment?
Yeah, I think what we found out, I think the partnership, because let's talk about 99th Street Elementary School, because I think I can give a lot of examples in Green Dot, which was charter public schools, but no, about traditional public schools, where that was a school, it's in the heart of Watts. It was one of the lowest performing elementary schools in all of LA Unified, and it was a place where there was very little parent engagement, and there was pockets of teachers on the campus that frankly didn't really believe in the kids and would communicate not directly but indirectly as such. But it's a school that literally 3 years later we had. It's now 800 API school, and it had the highest, some of the highest improvement of any elementary school in LA Unified. And there, what we did is, one, we found a really strong principal, as I mentioned, kind of the same formula. Two, they actually had a lot of good teachers who were dramatically, I think, underutilized and under potential because they had really bad leadership. And so, they actually had a decent concentration of talent at that school, that once they had the right kind of leader that gave them a lot of room and support, and that really made sure that a kid first and a kid belief agenda was there, that they came in strong. We made a couple moves on some teachers, a couple of teachers that were problematic, that one or two we were able to actually get rid of, but a couple just chose to leave because of the environment. We invested heavily in community partnerships. So we recognized that our kids had some issues that our teachers couldn't handle, and you can't expect a teacher to be a psychologist and a counselor and a police officer and a teacher at the same time. And so we were able to find some interesting relationships with some groups, some based in Watts that had real local relationships with kids and families, and some that were from out of Watts where Watts didn't have the capabilities to get it. And as I mentioned earlier, we invested a ton in family engagement. And literally we had donuts with dads where a lot of our kids didn't have dads. And so if you had a dad, your dad would come. If not, we brought police officers, firefighters, folks in the mayor's office, a lot of the African-American fraternities who did service work. Like, we had a lot of adult and men come, and they would come and read with our kids in the morning and kind of build in those adult figures. We had muffins with moms. We would do events with what we learned with our parents there was they'd been kind of rejected from the school for decades, and so they didn't come. So our first couple events were just fun events. They weren't policy or, hey, here's what you do for your kid. They were just literally kind of barbecues and parties to get started, build a relationship, and over time, literally that school, after 3 years, we had 96% of the families volunteer on the campus. Now, that's not to say we still didn't have some real bad issues come up that even with all that we were doing, we weren't completely equipped to handle, but we dramatically decreased the number of student issues by being able to address the ones that we could address by having the right staff and the right supports around our kids. And then you could isolate the smaller number of issues that, just given how challenging a lot of those kids' lives are in that community, we certainly couldn't get to all of them during the 5 years I was there, and it's hard to always get there. But we made significant progress by managing the things that we could manage and control as well as possible, as well as knowing what we didn't know and getting some help to come in and work with us on that.
You know, when tourism comes in here, he's coming later this afternoon, he will undoubtedly say, look, graduation rates for the first time are over 80%. Whatever I'm doing is working. And your response would be?
Yeah, so twofold. I think it's just important everyone looks at where we were on a relative basis, 10 and 20 years ago. So on a relative basis to the rest of the country, we're actually still we're still a little bit below the average in terms of graduation rates. We haven't improved dramatically on a relative basis to other states, and that's at a time where our country is performing the lowest it's ever performed internationally. Secondly, when you kind of go to the next level of detail in terms of college-ready graduation rates, you're still seeing statewide just very, very low numbers of the kids that are college-ready. I think we're still at a 70% remediation rate amongst incoming students in the Cal State system right now, and ultimately, and that's not to take away from where there are areas of progress, but I think if you look at all the data, both kind of outright and on a historical relative basis, we just haven't made significant gains, and we're 45th in math and reading today as a state, and we were 44th 20 years ago. So 80% is, it's a number that's been touted around a lot, but again, if you look at it compared to where we were nationally, it's basically we've been at the same pace to where we were 20 years ago on a relative basis, and we're trailing behind the world dramatically, and we've got, today in a month there's 2.5 million kids in California that are going to go to school that can't read and write at grade level. So I just think we need fundamental change at a much, much faster pace. I recognize faster is still a long time, but we've accepted kind of being stuck in neutral as a state, I think, for a couple of decades, and that needs to change, and it needs to change quickly.
One other question I wanted to ask you about, just cleaning up my list here. As you probably know, Prop 44, the Rainy Day Fund, has a companion piece of legislation that restricts local district reserves. Are you familiar with this?
Very familiar.
Okay, your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think it's, frankly, an example of the hypocrisy in the state leadership and the lack of independence. So you have a conversations around, hey, we're all about local control, and that's something that is touted consistently in the current state superintendent's materials. But then we're actually dictating to school districts what kind of reserve they can actually hold, particularly when we can, if you look at the data, the districts that did the best during the recession were the ones that actually had larger reserves and were able to fire less teachers in the midst of the chaos. And so I think that it's indicative of not having independent leadership that really is prioritizing kids and parents. And I've yet to hear a strong policy argument as to why we would cap the reserves. And as a practitioner, I have many reasons why it's better to not cap the reserves.
Do you have any political as opposed to policy thoughts as to why they may want to do this?
Oh, I think that over and over again, I think that CTA has too much influence on policy. I think that the way it was done at the last second, it seems that it is, as now that there's more money out there in terms of negotiating contracts and related, I think that certainly, not certainly, I can't say certainly because I don't know, but my best guess is that played a real role because there's been no other policy rationale as to why this needs to be done. So that tells me that that there is some influence being pushed behind the scenes, and it would make sense that it's CTA. Maybe it's not CTA, maybe it's somebody else, but what I know is it's not a state superintendent who's really prioritizing the needs of school districts and schools first and foremost. And I think it gets back to having a leader.
Well, let me ask you, this is not a state superintendent of schools policy vote. What would you have done if you were sitting in the Torres's seat?
I mean, this is where I think it's about leadership. Like, yeah, I don't have direct control over that, but the second that that actually comes forward, there's just no reason you can't have a state superintendent go and get a petition. You can get this done in a day or two with every superintendent, or as many as possible, up and down the state, pushing it both to all the media outlets as well as to the governor and the legislature, saying this is a problem, for our kids. And you're not just caught in this war of CTA lobbying versus AXA lobbying. You actually have your elected official who's supposed to be the public's top representative on education, who's saying this is bad for kids, and not just saying it by giving a press release, but actually organizing superintendents and parents to make sure there's a clear kind of voice. And even though it was a tight time frame in terms of when that got introduced and passed, it was there was still a couple of days, and that's the opportunity, in my opinion, for real leadership. And when you take a step back about how far forward our state needs to move, and also how complicated we have in terms of too many decisions being made by politicians and undue influence, I think by CTA in Sacramento, that's why it's so important to have a state superintendent who is pushing relentlessly, a kids first agenda, and actually knows that part of their job is to activate and organize people. And I'm not even saying organize with my own opinion, just get them involved in the issues, which then brings real transparency to light.
I'm sorry, Dan. I was just going to ask how satisfied you are with the structure of the position as it is right now.
I'm sorry, what?
I was just asking, with the structure of the position and the way it's organized right now, how comfortable are you with that? I mean, other states do it differently.
In terms of it being an elected position versus, sorry, can you just for clarification?
Or just the powers of the office, not so much being elected versus non-elected. It's more the powers of the office.
I mean, I think it's certainly complicated, as you know, with having power so distributed between legislature and governor and state board of education and state superintendent. But I believe that there is this position, because it's the one elected position, just focus on education. It's where it has real responsibility to first and foremost be an independent leader for kids and parents, and really always pushing that voice forward. And secondly, a responsibility, I believe, to lead on every policy issue. And again, not leading from perspective of what does Marshall Tuck think, but leading from perspective of what do educators and parents in the field and local communities actually believe. And I think with that, there's an ability to influence policy in a different way that hasn't been done before, for the legislature to go and to drive and to change. And I think that there's plenty that can be done that hasn't been done because it hasn't been independent, nor I think has it been really a proactive leadership position that's really prioritizing kids, and frankly held by somebody who's been just close to the work in terms of running schools and school districts.
Let me ask you one last thing here as we wrap up, or I think it's the last thing. In order to get into this position, you have to run in a political race, and I'm sure that's been enlightening to you. And you've gone through a primary now, and a fair amount of money was spent directed at you. What's the most unfair charge that was leveled against you?
I mean,
or
distortion. Right,
or
yeah, I mean, look, I think both the ads put against me were highly distorted, and some were just factually inaccurate. So the one TV ad was, I'm a Wall Street banker who spends millions of dollars on lavish trips and TV ads. I worked in investment banking when I was 22 and 23 years old. I've been, doing this work for 12 years. At the partnership, we spent no money on TV ads. We had a group, Fox Sports West, they ran ads for us for free to say, come volunteer at the toughest schools in LA. And so it was completely distorted ad that's completely false. They did another one about no confidence votes in our first year that were kind of, think of it as like what's going on with Duncan right now in the NAA and the AFT. Like literally there was an effort by UTLA against Villaraigosa in 2009, our first year around kind of, hey, it was a no confidence votes against Villaraigosa. There's a lot of politics behind it. They said that was no confidence votes against me, and the reality is in our surveys in our last year that I left the partnership, we had the vast majority of teachers feeling very good about the direction of schools and not having negative opinions of the partnership. So it's, I wasn't naive to it. I mean, I've been working in tough schools and tough communities for a long time. So it's unfortunate though that passes as an honest conversation about schools. I mean, and when we're drowning and our kids are really hurting in the state. But yeah, so I guess I give you two examples versus one, but there wasn't a lot of substance behind it.
I assume these were CTA ads?
Yeah, so one was Torgson's ad and one was CTA's ad.
Which one is the Torgson?
Torgson was the investment banker. I mean, he ran an ad that the third candidate, he ran an ad basically saying I was an investment banker who spent millions on TV ads, lavish trips. Our lavish trips where we paid for our teachers and principals to go visit other schools. I mean, it was just it was a complete mess. Not mess, but it was just distorted. But that's what it is.
You guys okay?
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
You know, can you give me a minute on the amortization? I'd love to just hear your perspective. So I mean, I know amortizing bonds. I just don't know.
Oh God.
I usually that's the first question I've had where I didn't, I want to get your perspective on it.
Most pension funds amortize over about 20 years.
Yeah, got it. So they're doing long. They're spreading out the amortization.
By amortizing over 32 years, and if you look at the structure of the way they're amortizing this, they actually have negative amortization.
So it's a big issue. Okay.
It's unconscionable.
Yeah.
But the bankers do well.
Yeah, well, so I guess I did spend a little time in finance, so I understand amortization. I spent a lot of time on the discount rate. I hadn't actually focused as much on the amortization, so it's helpful. So they're stretching that's also inflated to make the numbers look better.
Payoff period,
Yeah.
I think it's about 8 or 9 years of negative amortization.
Yeah.
10 years before you even begin to actually
get there.
pay down the debt.
Yeah. It makes sense. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah.